Hello, my name is Erica Hedrick, and I'm going to be going over my dissertation, which is titled Public Opinions of Mental Illnesses. So, stigmatization. Public opinions can be seen in different forms, and one way is stigmatization. And stigmatization refers to an individual's attributes that transmit negative characteristics and stereotypes which compromise the reputation of the individual. And in order for stigma to be seen and measurable in research, it kind of happens in four layers. So the first is labeling the individual as undesirable in some way. And then a stereotype happens by seeing all of these individuals in the same light. So for this, it would be for mental illness. They would see all these, anyone who has a mental illness as being undesirable. And the next is devaluation, which is taking their value away, saying that they're not as valued as others. And the last is social distance, which is creating an us versus them mentality, and it typically happens due to fear. Stigma according to diversity variables. Research has shown that stigma does differ according to diversity variables. The first is ethnicity. So, ethnic minorities express more stigmatizing attitudes than Caucasians. For gender, men typically are more likely to stigmatize than women, but men that have a mental disorder are going to be more stigmatized than women with a mental disorder. And the last is education. Research has found that the higher the education that an individual has, the less likely they're going to be to stigmatize. So does stigma differ depending on the disorder? We're going to be looking at two different disorders and then the comorbidity of the two. So the first is alcohol use disorder. Stigma is very prevalent surrounding alcohol use disorder. The first is that these individuals are deemed as being responsible for their condition. So individuals believe, well, you should just stop. The addiction isn't that bad, just quit. They are also seen as being weak-willed in terms of seeking treatment, even though research shows that they're just as likely to get treatment as any other individual with a mental disorder. The next is education. Research shows that in the past few decades, the research and education that has been presented to the public around alcohol use disorder has severely increased, yet the stigma has not decreased. It has simply remained the same over time. Amount of contact is shown to play a role in stigma. Specifically, the more contact that you have with an individual that has this disorder, the less likely you'll be to stigmatize. Research has found that for alcohol use disorder, genetics and biology may be a reason that people can get addicted more easily than others. And this has actually caused stigma to increase because of this, because they're seen as not being able to control any of their behaviors now because it's just biologically their makeup. And the last is dangerousness. They're seen as being more dangerous because of their disorder, yet research shows that although they are at more of a risk for suicide, they're not at more of a risk for being violent to others. The next disorder that we're going to look at is PTSD. And not a lot of research has been done surrounding stigma of PTSD. There's really only been one study to date that did this, that didn't look at it within military personnel. So I'm going to be discussing that study. It was the Australian National Survey of Mental Health Literacy and Stigma, and it showed that society's stigma towards those with PTSD is prevalent. Specifically, they found that 40% of participants described individuals with PTSD as being unpredictable. They stated that they wouldn't employ someone with this illness or vote someone into office with this condition. Yet this stigma still wasn't as high for those with this specific disorder, meaning that some of the other disorders they looked at was like schizophrenia, substance use disorders, and those were all more highly stigmatized than PTSD, even though PTSD stigma was still relevant. So does stigma differ if a person has two co-occurring disorders? So again, we're still specifically looking at the co-occurring disorder of PTSD and alcohol use disorder. There has not been much research surrounding comorbidity and how it affects stigma. There's only been one study to date, and it only looked at stigma through 2 questions and did not use a valid self report measure for stigma. But they did find that individuals with the comorbid condition of mood disorders and anxiety disorders related to more stigma than just having one mental diagnosis. So, what are the aims and hypotheses of my study? The first hypothesis is that PTSD will be less stigmatized than alcohol use disorder. The second is that alcohol use disorder and PTSD will be less stigmatized than the comorbidity, so if somebody just has one disorder versus 2. And the last is going to be an exploratory hypothesis, which we're going to be looking at the covariates for our participants in terms of race, education, and gender to see the specific role that it plays in stigma. And based off of past research, we believe that participants who are of ethnic minorities will stigmatize more than Caucasians. Again, participants who have higher education will stigmatize less, and that males will stigmatize more than females. Here are my reference slides, and that's all I have for you. Thank you.